Thank you.
All right, let's get started with our panel on law and regulatory issues in this complex time. We have Lloyd Mayer from Notre Dame. We have Dana Brackman-Reeser from Brooklyn. And we have, who's Norm Silber from Yale and Hofstra. And so each is going to talk for about 10, 12 minutes informally about their work and their paper. And then we're just going to open it up for a broad conversation. And Lloyd, please take it away.
Sure. So this paper is at a very preliminary stage, which is why you don't actually have a copy of it, though the other panelists have seen a very rough first draft. What this paper focuses on is the issue of the federal tax law limitations on speech for charities. And I think this paper actually, somewhat accidentally, is particularly timely given the sharp political divisions we have these days, as well as the heated debates about economic and racial justice, which it's natural for charities to engage with on all sides of these issues. And of course, generally, we know that the legal structure for charities under the federal tax law and under state law allows a great amount of freedom for charities to choose within a very broad range of vaguely defined purposes how they pursue public benefit, both the means that they use and the goals that they pursue. But at the same time, under federal tax law, there are limitations on speech, and there have been increasing proposals over time to limit speech by charities. And the point of this paper is to explore sort of holistically this tension between the freedom we give charities on one side, in part justified by promoting pluralism and our pluralistic society, and these restrictions on at least the types of speech they can engage in, on the other hand. Now, just to, as for reason I'll detail in a moment, basically where I come out is that if you go back to sort of first principles on why we have charities, and particularly why we subsidize them through the federal tax law, that creates, I believe, a presumption, for reasons I'll get to in a moment, a presumption that there shouldn't be restrictions on the speech that charities can engage in. But it's not an irrebuttable presumption. There may be aspects of the sort of fundamental character of charities under the law which indicate that certain types of speech should in fact be disfavored or even prohibited for charities, given that they receive benefits under federal tax law. More specifically, not to hide the ball here, I think that the existing prohibition on political campaign intervention supporting opposing candidates is justified, going back to those first principles, but I'm less convinced that the limitation on lobbying is justified for reasons I'll get into. At the same time, there have been proposals over time to expand the limitations on charities with other forms of advocacy, which I also think are not justified. And most recently, there's been a debate about hate speech, about whether charities that are hate groups, which means primarily they engage in hate speech, attacking other groups within society, asserting the dominance of one group over the others, particularly white supremacist groups. And there's an interesting question about whether the federal tax laws could or should be modified to prohibit groups that engage in hate speech, however exactly defined, from receiving the benefits of charitable status under federal tax law. So the first principle that I sort of go back to and is the theories that all of you are very familiar with, I'm sure, that justify not only the existence, but the support the federal tax system provides, the subsidy it provides to charities on the grounds that there are failures in other parts of our society that lead charities in the best position to provide certain goods and services. So you have the economic failure arguments, the market failure arguments, and you have the government failure arguments. And what's interesting, I think, about those theories, as a number of people have written, Rob Atkinson and Miranda Perry Fleischer most recently, is that inherent in those justifications for our current federal tax system is a assumption, sometimes explicit, sometimes implicit, that what we really are subsidizing is choice. What we're really subsidizing is the ability of charities, the leaders, the donors, the supporters, the beneficiaries to choose certain goods and services they want to see produced in the charitable sector, and then the market failures and government failures theories kick in to see which ones are actually justified for that sector. The idea being that if there's not really a market failure, the for-profits will take over an area. If there's not really a government failure, the government will take over an area. but it allows charities a broad range of freedom within, again, the very broad charitable purposes to pursue their vision of what it means to be charitable or educational or scientific or whatever. And so really what we're subsidizing is that choice. And some political theorists make that even more explicit. They say what we're really subsidizing, and Rob Reich has written about this in a book he wrote recently, what we're really subsidizing is pluralism. What we're really subsidizing is the ability of groups of citizens to not only have groups that pursue their vision of the public benefit, but actually we support them doing that through the subsidies the federal tax system provides, through exemption and deductibility of contributions, and that's a good thing. We want to support pluralism, particularly in the heterogeneous United States society. We want people to be able to get their ideas and their visions of the public benefit out there. When they can't, because of those barriers, get them out through the market or get them out through government, we want to give them an avenue. We actually want to support them in doing that. Now, to be fair, there are people that would argue charities should pursue more narrow goals. So maybe they should only be charities if they relieve poverty in some significant way, or maybe they support economic redistribution more generally. But that's not the system we have. So taking the system we have as a given, my argument would be that we have a system that promotes choice and freedom among those who support and lead and found charities and actually use charitable services. And that if that's the system we have, that would argue that we should allow freedom of choice with respect to how they speak as well, what they speak about, what categories of speak they use, what positions they take within fairly large boundaries. So that gets you a presumption, but it's not an irrebuttable presumption. So the next step is to say, is there anything about certain kinds of speech which is incompatible with the fundamental characteristics of charities under the law? And of course, one of the fundamental characteristics is the prohibition on private benefit, that we don't allow charities to benefit private individuals, shareholders, businesses, whatever. And I think that fundamental characteristic of charities in the law supports the prohibition on political campaign intervention, on opposing or supporting candidates. And my reasoning here, and I'm not the first person to say this. In fact, the first person in print to say this, I think, may have been Greg Colvin, who was a practitioner in San Francisco, is that when a charity supports a candidate, they can't just support the narrow issue which is of concern for them and that they believe furthers their charitable purpose. They have to support the whole candidate. They have to support basically the candidate's entire agenda, and they have to support ultimately the candidate getting elected to a position of power, of a public office. And that is a non-incidental private benefit for that candidate. And that essentially means that being able to support a candidate conflicts generally with the requirement that you not have private benefit for a charity. I think that argument works. I think it doesn't work as well when you turn to other forms of advocacy and even lobbying. Because when you lobby, a charity can focus on its particular issue of concern. It can really only speak about the particular thing that it thinks is important for the government to do, and in furtherance of what it perceives as its charitable mission. And so that you really don't have that same private benefit concern. Interestingly, historically, the lobbying limitation was initially enacted in part because of private benefit concerns. The members of Congress couldn't figure out how to make it narrow enough to just address private benefit. So they just made it all lobbying. I think that also argues against any broader attempts to limit advocacy by charities, like the Defund the Left movement in the 1990s. And so, again, that's not justified by any particular characteristic of charities. The case gets a little, now these sort of issues have been talked about and written about by many, many articles, and probably many people here have written those articles or certainly read them. There's been less discussion, though recently it's been an issue of some debate about hate speech and hate groups. As you may know, the IRS has denied tax exempt status to a handful of hate groups on the grounds they're promoting violence and illegal activity and basically just making inflammatory comments. But there have been a number of groups, which I think could fairly be characterized as white supremacist groups, that are tax exempt as charities. In fact, they were highlighted during the Trump administration because reporters suddenly discovered, thank you, Mark, that they were out there. And the question is, well, hate groups are bad, right? They are harmful. they're harmful to society. So that clearly contradicts the public benefit requirement of charities. But the problem is who defines the harm, right? We generally don't put a public benefit filter except at the very farthest edges. What are the farthest edges? Illegal activity, acting contrary to fundamental public policy. And then when it comes to educational messages, which is what these groups tend to fall under, educational purposes, the IRS has come up with a methodology test to say, well, if your so-called education is just inflammatory comments, unsupported opinion, distorted facts, call it fake news, then you can't do that. That's not really educational. So that's all you do. You're not a charity. But those are the extremes. So if you can present a plausible, semi-reasonable, semi-supported, non-inflammatory argument for why, as some of these groups do, whites are superior, the IRS won't deny you tax-exempt status on that grounds. And as much as that speech is reprehensible from my viewpoint, I think that's the right call. The reason there's such a broad definition of educational is it's not the IRS's place to define public benefit, and Congress, and we've chosen through our system not to narrow what it means to be educational or more narrowly define what is public benefit. At the same time, I think the limit on fake news, on inflammatory comments, relying on distorted facts and so forth, is justified because it is not educational, because it doesn't further anything that could plausibly be called a public benefit, but it's only at the extremes. I mean, the group I love that the IRS denied status for this was a group that was promoting the view that the federal government enslaved Hollywood celebrities. The IRS did not grant them tax-exempt status as an educational charity, but that's the sort of extreme position, as well as promoting illegal activity and so forth. Now, again, just to wrap up, we can imagine a narrow legal regime where we defined what goods a charity has to pursue, what public benefit means in a narrow way, has to relieve poverty, has to line up with government priorities in some way, and so forth. But that's not what we've done, at least in the United States. And I think given that we've chosen give this freedom and liberty to charities that we subsidize, I think that extends to the speech that they engage in as well, except for the limited circumstances I've mentioned. I look forward to your comments.
Lloyd, thank you, and welcome to those who've joined since Lloyd was beginning to speak. Put, Mung, Eleanor, Ian, Mary Beth. And we're going to turn now to Dana Brackman-Reeser. Dana, take it away.
I always forget that. Sorry about that. So my paper is kind of in the exact opposite place from where Lloyd is starting, him being at a very formative stage, and my paper is already published. So but I'm presenting it here because it did just come out, and I'm sorry for the words on the screen. If you guys are seeing the closed captioning,
there it is. Yeah.
That's something that my my school does for accommodating students, and I can't turn it off. So sorry about that. This paper was developed as part of a symposium issue on the 50th anniversary of the 1969 Tax Reform Act. And even though it did just come out, I'm presenting it today because it's a project that I'm continuing to pursue with additional research. And so I'm really interested to hear your thoughts as I continue kind of down the road that I started in this paper. So the paper is about how the current set of foundation regulations kind of maps not particularly well with the idea of aligning foundation investments with their charitable missions. And many of the folks here, I'm sure, are familiar with values-aligned investing. Lots of foundations consider this option, and some were early adopters. There's kind of wide purchase around values-aligned investing, developing across all kinds of asset owners globally. We're seeing huge shifts depending on how broadly you kind of think of that umbrella. You could think about the shift into ESG investments, or even just something like the growth in impact investments and impact investment funds. So this idea of creating impact through foundation investments um, first needs to kind of take on the siloed nature of activity in foundations, where on the grant making side, you typically don't see much in the way of investments except for program related investments, which really are substitutes for grants and involve typically low risk adjusted expected returns. They can be large stakes in the enterprises involved, but they generally are quite small deal sizes compared to other kinds of investments. And this overlaps with both direct and fund-based impact investing that's happening by non-foundation investors as well. Then on the endowment side of foundations, you see what is often called mission-related investing, which is an effort to generate together both financial and mission-aligned returns in terms of social return, but can involve trading off financial and other kinds of returns, and involves all kinds of different types of investments across all asset classes and sizes of potential stakes. So in the paper, I'm really talking about both of those things and how the 1969 Act, as it's been updated over time, doesn't fit perfectly with a view of encouraging either of those types of activity, and kind of questioning whether there's more unfinished impact business that we could do by making changes to that regulatory structure. The paper kind of proceeds by working through the relevant 1969 Act provisions, the excess business holding rules, the jeopardizing investment rules, talks about some updates and changes in the last few years, and then canvasses potential further reforms. And it's that area around further reforms that I'm really continuing to work, particularly in the area of potential reforms to encourage mission-related investments, so on that endowment side. So I'm not going to go through all the details of the excess business holding restrictions here. Suffice it to say that these rules limit the size of stakes that foundations can hold in any particular business entity. And the idea is to kind of limit their holdings in a way to avoid entanglement with kind of related businesses of their managers or donors, as well as to keep their focus on running the foundation's mission-related business rather than focusing by being a major block holder on a corporate entity's goals and business. And there are these rules have been very stable. They took a long time to phase in because at the time of the 1969 Act, many foundations were in quite serious violation of these rules if they were to have initially been applied. So there was a quite slow phase in, but other than that, the rules here have been really quite consistent, haven't seen much in the way of changes. They were extended to a degree to donor advised funds and supporting organizations. A limited exception was enacted in 2018, but it really was created for the Newman's Own Foundation and wouldn't apply to most of the kinds of investment activity that I'm talking about. The other area of regulation is the jeopardizing investment restrictions. This is essentially a federal application of a prudent investor standard that requires the foundation investment decisions to be made as a prudent person would, considering the need to diversify, looking at a combination of risk and return, and is policed in the same way as the excess benefit rules are, with two-tiered penalty taxes. And the way both of these work is there's an initial relatively moderate tax that applies for violation. And if the violation isn't cured, there's a confiscatory second level tax. So no rational foundation is going to fail to cure. They're not going to be subject to that confiscatory tax. So it operates kind of like a prohibition, even though it's really works as a tax penalty. The prudent investor idea in the jeopardizing investment restrictions, the penalties apply not only to the foundation, but also to managers. And this is where we see the first and really only contemplation by the 1969 Act of investments being pursued for mission-related purposes. So the program-related investment exception was created in the statute through some interesting historical kind of lobbying by innovative foundations who were doing some of these deals at the time. And the idea is that if a foundation makes an investment for the primary purpose to accomplish charitable purposes and not for a significant purpose of producing income or appreciating their property, then these are treated as outside of this jeopardizing investment restriction, which is important because if you're going to make an investment that's really a substitute for a grant that has a very low rate of return or very high risk, you might be in violation of the standard restrictions. But the idea is to kind of equate them more to grants, that this is the way that you might be using investments as a better tool in a particular scenario to pursue your charitable mission as a foundation. So if your investment qualifies as a program-related investment, it's per se not jeopardizing. There's also an exception to the excess business holding rules for program-related investments. And in fact, they do essentially substitute for grants in terms of the 5% payout. So these are some of the updates. There were updates both relevant to PRIs and to MRIs. In 2016, Treasury finally, after over a decade of advocacy by exempt organizations lawyers, adopted new examples in the regulations that approve particular kinds of models of investment as PRIs. But they continue to focus on risk-adjusted return, and most importantly, for my purposes, continue to talk about below market terms and the lack of appeal to traditional investors as kind of the hallmarks of program-related investments. So to be a program-related investment, you really get a strong message that it kind of has to be a bad deal. And that makes sense considering how it's going to substitute for grants in the regulatory structure. The 2015 change to the regulatory kind of environment was Treasury guidance that clarifies that foundations can consider all the relevant facts and circumstances when they make decisions, including the foundation's charitable purposes. So this is making clear that mission-related investing will not necessarily violate the jeopardizing investment restrictions, that private foundations need not select investments only because they offer the highest rates of financial return and the lowest risk, or because of their liquidity value, but they can select investments in part out of their concern for furthering their charitable mission. Of course, they still have to act prudently. They can't jeopardize charitable purposes, but this means that motion-related investment is permissible. And there's been some more uptake since 2015, including by some big foundations, thank you, Mark, like Ford, that made a big announcement of devoting a significant part of its endowment to this kind of activity. But despite some of those splashes, not maybe as much mission-related investment uptake as you might expect. And so the final part of this paper and what I'm continuing to work on is really thinking about, well, what more might the regulatory framework do if the goal were to increase program-related investment or mission-related investment uptake? And of course, this is subject to the query that's at the bottom of this slide. Should we do that? Is that a valuable goal? There are arguments that program-related investment and mission-related investment are not necessarily the best thing for foundations to be doing with their assets. And I do want to take those issues on probably in even more future work. But my current project in progress is around kind of thinking through what regulatory measures might be undertaken to try to increase uptake, particularly around mission-related investments. I think PRIs, it's mostly about continuing to reduce the regulatory uncertainty, maybe new regulations that don't focus as much on examples and give kind of broader guidance, as well as some sector-based efforts for leaders in the area to continue to work on disseminating what they know and helping other, perhaps smaller foundations to pursue these kinds of activities. But for MRI, I think there is more that you could do in terms of regulatory changes. Of course, you could just codify the Treasury Bulletin, which now is helpful, but is not necessarily going to be something you could rely on forever. It could be withdrawn. I think that you could incentivize MRI by creating relief from some of the regulation that applies to mission related investments. An example would be creating an excess business holdings exception like there is for PRIs. I might also think about a nudge that you might make by a disclosure requirement that foundations need to disclose on their 990 how they align their investments with their charitable mission, and if they do not, explain why not. We've seen how disclosure requirements do push charities to change governance activities, and I thought investment might also work that way too. And of course, the most aggressive move would be to just mandate some level of MRI on the theory that we force foundations to pay out 5% a year in grants. Maybe we should be forcing them to do something aligned with their mission with the other 95%. Of course, the challenge with all of these types of ideas is really around definitions, what's going to count as a mission related investment, and somewhat related to Lloyd's paper, who gets to decide what is mission related and isn't, and whether the IRS will be kind of well placed to police these kinds of additional requirements. But I think it's a task worth considering and worth putting some effort into working out the options. And so I look forward to your comments as I continue that work.
Dana, thank you very much. And while you will not have seen the chat while you were talking, people are very impressed with the text tool, the captioning tool that Brooklyn Law School is using.
Thank
and
you.
I, for one, will be asking you afterward which product they're using.
It really just is through PowerPoint, but I'm happy to talk to anyone later.
Very good. Thank you, Dana. And we're going to turn now to Norm Silber. And again, welcome to those who've come in since I last said this. I think that's Sungju. Norm, you're next.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to share the...
Louder is better.
Okay, hold on. Don't know if I can get louder. Hold on.
Oh, I didn't mean to put you through on that.
Okay, wait a minute. I'm working on it. I don't know what I can do here. Well, I don't know. Am I audible? Am I audible?
Yeah, yeah.
I'm going to share the draft that I prepared for our NOVA because I don't have PowerPoints and I wouldn't want to compete with Dana. There's no way. This is, you know, if Lloyd's is a draft, mine is like a Peanuts bubble. As usual, I have chosen our NOVA to present the first version, the very first version of some thoughts that I have that grow out of some lawsuits that I think most of you already know about, but they're now about 110 class action lawsuits that have been brought against educational institutions after they switched to Zooming during the pandemic. And the students were arguing and have been arguing that this was a breach of contract. And as I'll get to shortly, there are many other kinds of causes of action that they've brought and that could be brought. And I thought I would combine it also with not just educational institutions, but also institutions of arts and cultural institutions, because although there have not been very many lawsuits brought against arts and arts institutions and museums per se, we do have a number of actions that have been brought against for-profit amusement parks and other sorts of institutions, which are quite comparable to nonprofits. And what I'm going to argue, to cut to the chase, what I'm going to argue at the end of the paper is that it really, the cases that have been decided and the arguments that have been made are really incoherent. And instead, it seems to me that, the reason is that they haven't squarely faced what is the key issue, which is, are nonprofit organizations different, exceptional in the current situation, in the same way that the law has treated nonprofits as exceptional in certain other instances? It seems to me that the best thing to do is to recognize that the culture as a whole has a stake in the survival of nonprofit institutions, so that in catastrophes such as the ones that we're currently living through, it seems to me that the law needs to do what it has done in other settings, and to recognize that without making the law somewhat different for nonprofits than it is for for-profit institutions, we would be sacrificing and impoverishing society. So the first point is really that the reports of the financial health of nonprofits is quite dismal, and I'm sure that everybody here at the Zoom conference is aware of that. It's predicted that there may be as many as 90 colleges that in the next several years will fold because of the problems that have arisen with closing down, and the problems that have arisen with respect to the balance sheet losses, and the problems that have arisen because there are problems attracting enrollments going forward. With respect to arts institutions, it's pretty clear that they are among the hardest hit nonprofits as a result of the COVID crisis. The studies that I have seen suggest that as many as that in the nonprofit sector, unemployment has fallen steepest in the arts and museums and theater sector total, something like 35% loss of employment in those sectors. So at the same time as we have this crisis in nonprofit arts and educational institutions, we also have, as I think some of us are more aware than others, a real crisis in consumer welfare. And it may well be that those of us in the middle class or the upper professional classes will get through the pandemic in a decent shape. But it's nonetheless the case that, particularly if you're talking about students who are starting out in life economically, that there is a significant problem keeping their heads above water. So, so what's been going on? So we have this clash between two groups, two cohort groups that are both being pressed by the pandemic: consumers on one hand and nonprofits on the other hand. And those of you who know me know that I guess in the last 20 years in our Nova, I presented maybe 5 or 6 papers, all of which are about the intersection between consumer problems and the nonprofit sector. The do not call exemption, if you remember that, which pitted nonprofit groups that wanted an exception from being harassed by phone calls. They wanted the right to harass consumers, and consumers who wanted them to be added, or privacy rights for donors. So this sort of fits in my work in terms of my concern about how do you reconcile the tensions that exist between consumer rights and nonprofit organizational rights. So let me just tell you a little bit about, let me proceed down here a little bit. Hold on. So let me talk a little bit about the right to a refund. So the responsibility to refund to a consumer is well established in the law. And it's both established in contract law, and it's also established in dozens of consumer statutes. And it also exists in regulatory fashion. So for example, it is a defense to payment of a student loan if you did not receive adequate consideration for the loan in the first place. So if a student is able to establish, for example, that there was a breach on the part of the educational institution, and that therefore they deserved a tuition break or some sort of pro rata discount of their tuition, then that's going to be helpful to them as a defense to payment of a student loan in the future. Now, those who are alleging breach of performance face have a number of possible options. So for example, typically there's a formal agreement between a consumer and either an arts organization or an educational institution. In the case of an educational institution, it's usually much more formal. In the case of getting a subscription to Carnegie Hall or a concert series, we know that that's typically much less well articulated, but that almost always one will find policies about a refund. So when an agreement or a policy is breached, then there are a number of common law and statutory causes of action. Failure of consideration, partial failure of consideration, claims in fraud, claims in misrepresentation, claims in unjust enrichment, failures to perform. All of these could apply to most of the common fact situations that we're talking about in these class action suits and potentially in suits against arts organizations. So the claims could be made for complete refund, or the claims could be made for a pro rata refund for the diminished value of the services they received, or they could be made for restitution, as for example, where a theater or a school is holding on to revenue and it hasn't provided value. And as you know, the traditional measure, or you may or may not know, the traditional measure in contract law for damages is called the expectation measure. And that's the difference between the performance that was promised and the performance that was delivered. And per the restatement of contracts, which those of us who are lawyers know, under the classic rule of Hadley against Baxendale, the rule is you're also entitled to the foreseeable the consequential damages that are foreseeable. So essentially, if you weren't able to attend class and you had to buy tuition, you had to buy books, you're able to claim the value of the books as well as the tuition. If you were scheduled to fly to Georgia to go to Emory, and you had to buy plane tickets and then have housing there, and you signed a lease, conceivably, and now that the COVID crisis has led them to tell you not to come to campus, well, conceivably, you ought to be able to claim for some of those losses as well. So let me tell you about a couple of cases, because of the interest of time. First, let me refer to you about arts organizations. In the case of arts organizations, most of them have developed a set of policies that involve offering either a conversion to a donation, which would be tax deduction, or a credit for future performances, or a refund. And when they do that, the groups have found, for example, at the Mark Taper Theater, they found that that when we're talking about a subscription series, 30% donated their tickets, 42% requested a credit, and 28% requested a refund. And that roughly those numbers have held true. In the case of single performances, it's typically been a little different. More people, as many as 50%, have asked for refunds. So the situation is such that most of these matters have been handled strategically, because after all, most nonprofit organizations have every incentive to make peace with their subscription base. And most nonprofit educational institutions don't want dissatisfied alumni and grumbling, and they're looking forward to contributions once they get out. So most of these cases have not gone to court, but some of them have gone to court, and others may be anticipated. So let me tell you about one case. There are only a couple of reported cases. How many minutes do I have, Mark?
You have 1 minute.
Uh-oh. Okay, I won't tell you about those cases. I'll tell you just about one case. In Maine, somebody wanted to go, had a junior year at an arts institution. She was going to go to Amsterdam. And the exchange program said, no, you can't, she went to Amsterdam. They ended the program a week after it started. She had to go home, and they told her, well, it's perfectly adequate for us to let you take online classes, right? You can take online classes to get credit. Well, that's not the reason. She was going to Amsterdam. The reason for that was the reason all juniors go to Amsterdam is to have a good time, right? So in some sense, the court didn't want to grapple with that. The court said, essentially, well, you've really done what you've needed to do to the exchange program. And they basically used a sort of narrow textual analysis of the agreement to say that, well, you could have gotten a complete refund if you had wanted it before the program started, but after that, the risk transferred to you. My conclusion is that we need to do something much more honest and forthright. What we need to do is to recognize that, as in charitable immunity cases and as in other cases involving the nonprofit sector, especially in a catastrophe, we need to say, let's differentiate in contract law between the standard that we use for breach and damages when we are dealing with a normal situation for nonprofits or for-profit organizations, and one that relates to a time when we're talking about a catastrophe in the entire nonprofit sector. So I'll stop here because I'm out of time.
Norm, thank you very much. And let me say these three presentations by these three scholars exemplify the vibrancy and robustness of the nonprofit law and regulation field these days around the world, not just in the United States. I want to go to Meng first, and who's posted a question in chat, but I'm going to invite Meng to come on and to actually say her question, if you would, Meng, for those who may not have the chat in front of them.
Okay, thank you. I have a question for Dana.
Actually, if you could introduce yourself, because some people may not know you on this.
Okay, I am now a PhD student in public policy at the Georgia State University, but I'm a former student of WUNA like 9 years ago, and I worked at China Philanthropy Research Institute, so sometime together with Mark in the legislative process of China's first law. So I was a charity law researcher before joining the PhD program here in the United States. And we did a lot of research on US charity law and England's charity law when we were submitted our suggestion for the People's Congress of China. And so this question actually was a lingering question from before. First is, so what is the difference between excessive holding constraint I believe it is applicable to private foundations and to feeder organizations defined in the IR code 502. So I can't remember the exact ratio, but I think feeder organization, a foundation or maybe other kind of charity can hold a higher ratio of their share. And also I'm interested in how the prudent investor standards has been implemented in practice. So are there any cases that the trustees and the foundations were fined for their irrational investments, and how high the bar is to prove such a violation of prudence? And how many states use the standards? Because I'm not very familiar with the US system, but I think that's first some kind of association recommended standards, and then each state adopt it. So I'm just wondering how is it the current state of this standards being applied in any place in the US? Thank you.
And Dana, feel free to answer as much of this now as you want, and on others to get back to Meng directly, whichever you want to do.
Of course. So so my understanding of Section 502 is that it really deals with a different problem of essentially business entities that are trying to obtain tax exemption by turning over their profits to charitable purposes and precluding that as an exempt organization. So I'm not totally tracking on the connection, but maybe we can follow up afterwards on that. The other questions though that you ask are, I feel like are important to clarify. So the last thing you were talking about in terms of state law. So I was talking only about federal law, the law that applies to private foundations to maintain their tax exemption as private foundations. State law, of course, is an independent body of law that regulates private foundations, which are typically set up either as nonprofit corporations or as charitable trusts, both those organizational types are also kind of broadly speaking under state law required to adhere to a kind of prudent investor standard, although there's some variation, of course, between the two organizational forms and across states. But it's not going to be a straight application of this federal law. Although a lot of states do incorporate the private foundation rules into their state law. So that's kind of like a double whammy for those private foundations in those states. But I think kind of the gist of your question, or the most important thing to underscore, is how serious a risk are these restrictions for private foundations? Are these really the cause of private foundations failing to engage in, as much mission-related investment as I might prefer? And I think the answer is really, it's mixed. So on the one hand, if you're talking about large, very sophisticated private foundations who have counsel, they know how to follow these rules, and it's going to be almost impossible for them to trip up and run into problems in terms of enforcement. But if you're thinking about smaller foundations that don't benefit from expert counsel, certainly not in-house counsel, then I think these restrictions are more worrisome because they are kind of similarly, again, to the area that Lloyd was talking about. They're kind of just like laying out ground rules about, like, this is not what charities do, right? Foundations invest in safe investments that are going to give them the most return possible, and then they use those returns to fund grants. It's more about the kind of norm setting around what foundations will do and trying to shift those norms, which is why I think both a change in regulation as well as kind of sector initiated activity can have an impact on shifting some of that activity. So I'll stop there so we have time for other questions.
Dana, could I just chime in on that for a minute? The interesting thing about that is, there are rules about blockers and transparency that would go a long way toward addressing the question, I think, more than even the PRI rules. If you simply exposed, for example, the amount of money that hedge funds are spending on purposes that are diametrically opposite to the missions of these organizations, environmental organizations that invest in hedge funds that are buying fracking companies. I mean, that's not transparent right now. And it seems to me that part of your project should be looking at that as well.
Thanks, Norman. Your paper is very much something that I'm thinking about as I go forward.
Ian, then Tony.
Thanks, Mark. I guess my question was for Norm, just wondering, and I'm sure you've looked at it in your paper, Norm, just in terms of how the doctrine of frustration plays out, because I imagine that would often leave the loss lying with the students who are upset at the frustrating event. But yeah, just wondering how that's playing out in the cases that you've looked at.
Well, it's funny. There's, I guess the US and Australia would all go back to the British case of Krell v. Henry, which is one where the king's coronation was going to happen. And a consumer argued that they should not be held responsible for the room that they rented for the king's coronation. And the court held that indeed, because of frustration, the student was absolved of that. I mean, the patron was absolved. There hasn't been a lot of litigation that's been decided yet, but there's an interesting case that just came down in Massachusetts in which the court dismissed the suit for a tuition refund, but allowed the case to go forward on various recreation fees and physical activity fees, which were in fact impossible for the student to actually take advantage of, given the COVID close down. So in that sense, it is based on a kind of frustration sort of analysis.
Thank you. Tony. Rich Putt is the order I currently have. Tony, you're up.
Yeah, hi there. My question is for Lloyd. Lloyd, I thought your argument was really interesting. Putting aside the American case, if you did wave a wand and enacted a policy that could put, just keep everyone in their lane when it comes to this idea of freedom of speech and what type of speech civil society organizations might have, what concern do you have, if any, that other countries around the world might look to the policies of democracy in America, bring those home, and maybe pervert them for political expedience in their own countries? Just wondering if you think there could be any negative fallout for other countries following the American example?
So I assume what you mean is that if the U.S. did expand the limitations on speech associated with charities, I think you're right. You do create that risk. I mean, we all know in the Zoom room that it's not about existence, right? I mean, this is about a subsidy. And that's actually could be an important distinction and argues for why maybe, white supremacist groups can exist, but we don't necessarily want to subsidize them. And so that's why we would prohibit them from speaking. But that distinction tends to get lost in the media. And so I think if it was said that the U.S. penalized or disfavored or whatever, stripped certain groups because they advocate certain positions, which of course would be a huge First Amendment problem as well, of the benefits of charitable status, that could easily be seen as a license to not only strip groups of certain tax benefits, but just strip them of even the ability to exist, to have legal existence by other countries that want to selectively choose who gets to speak. And of course, many people in this meeting, Mark in particular, are familiar with countries that cherry pick among the nonprofits, the ones they like that support the state's agenda, and the ones they don't like because they somehow conflict with the state agenda. And that's certainly not something that I think the United States would want to provide, I would hope would want to provide cover for in any way.
Mung and I have no idea what you're talking about, Lloyd. On to Rich.
I'm unmuted. Enjoyed your talk, Lloyd. So I think at least it's new to me to look at adjusting restrictions on speech based on non-distribution. But I'm pretty familiar with the constitutional issues, and in regulating fundraising as speech, it's been declared as core political speech and public education speech. And I'm wondering to what extent that would also apply to hate speech by a nonprofit.
So I didn't have time because of a limited time to talk about the constitutional issues. I do plan to address them in my paper. But one interesting aspect of all this from the constitutional perspective is that the challenges that have been brought to the limitations on political campaign activity and lobbying have all failed, even though that is core protected speech and the Supreme Court's holdings. And the basis seems to be that we have a subsidy here. And so Congress is free to choose whether to subsidize certain kinds of speech and not to subsidize other kinds, because you can still engage in that speech. Again, this is about subsidy, not existence. So, for example, if Congress wanted to say, well, we're going to limit educational purposes to a classroom setting, virtual or physical, but a place where you have, as is defined elsewhere in the code for other purposes, a regular curriculum, a regular faculty, and regular students. So all these other groups that are out there educating about whatever they're educating about, which are also not just hate groups, but civil rights or environmental issues or whatever, none of them are going to be charities because they're not traditional schools. Probably the Supreme Court would say that's fine because Congress isn't obliged to subsidize any particular type of speech. Congress can't pick and choose. We're going to subsidize pro-environmental speech, but not pro, pollution speech or whatever, But if they want to just say, hey, we're not going to subsidize any lobbying on any side, they're free to do that.
So you know the law far better than me as an economist, but I remember a talk from Harvey Dale on unconstitutional conditions and how the picture that you just shared is not nearly so clear cut as the way you shared it, and some dicta in some of the decisions. So, you're going to pursue this paper and I'm sure you'll get it all straight, but be very careful with those two complications.
Yeah, you should be aware that in the most recent unconstitutional conditions case involving a nonprofit involving the Open Society Institute versus USAID, the Supreme Court actually equated the subsidies charities receive with a government-funded program. In dicta, to be fair. And they ruled in favor of the nonprofit as a compelled speech case, but they at least suggested that, Congress can impose restrictions if they want.
Time to pack the Supreme Court. Next person.
Can I just chime in here, Lloyd? I was going to ask you about what's wrong with the model that NIH and NEH use, which has been upheld. This is in line with what Rich is saying, which is to say peer groups and peer review groups, professional peer review groups that draw those lines in a nonpartisan way. That's throughout your, I mean, the point about your paper that somewhat bothered me was that you often say, well, it's too hard to draw a line. And I find that, you know, that argument about it being too hard to draw the line is not one that I find intrinsically persuasive intuition in terms of my own intuition.
Well, I'd have to go and look at the NIH stuff. All I'll say on that is it goes back to the question I think other people have already mentioned, you know, who makes the decision? Do we want the IRS? You know, do we hire people at the IRS to make decisions about that as opposed to scientists, you know, evaluating what research projects should be directly funded? The IRS does not employ people to determine what is well substantiated educational content. Maybe they could, but that sounds like we need a new agency at that point. Without being Potter Stewart, I mean, you know, when you see it, you know, hate groups. I'm not persuaded about hate groups. It seems to me that reasonable people could, certainly reasonable people who are involved in issues all the time, might be able to have a core understanding of what a hate group is.
Thank you all. And I think we're going to wind up giving the last question to Put Barber. Put, you're on.
You're muted.
You're muted.
You're muted, Put.
Push the unmute.
I was speculating while Norm was talking about a further reach of whether a student who was denied adequate education because of the school's restrictions could sue for lost future earnings.
Oh.
That's pretty speculative.
But it seems like if the point of going to school was to enable yourself to enter an occupation and the school fails to provide you with what you need to do that.
They all go online so that you can take courses that get you the credits to get you sub-qualified for the bar. If they were to cancel classes entirely, and then you would have a very good case.
Yes.
Anyone else? We have a couple minutes left. Our bosses at Arnova don't want us going late, but if there's anyone else, I think I see Eleanor first and then Una if there's time.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if I've misunderstood this, but somehow I have a feeling, and I think it was somewhere in Lloyd's discussion, that there's an implication, or at least there was an undercovering of this notion that was in fact raised before the 1969 Tax Act, which was the question of whose dollars are these tax dollars really. I sort of heard that idea that by subsidizing these groups, we are in fact giving them money by reducing their taxes, but that's money which is in the public domain and maybe is really a gift to them. Is that, it's not the clearest way of putting it, but is that tax expenditure concept running in there?
Short answer, yes.
Yeah, I have to see your paper because I'm interested in how you use it.
And I think, thank you, Eleanor. And I think Una's going to have the last question.
Thank you, Mark. And I just want to circle back to Dana and thank you everybody for such great papers. But every time I hear mention of program related investment, I have to hark back to John Simon and his great work with the Economic Foundation. And I wonder, Dana, in your research, when no doubt you were reviewing what John had done to bring about program related investment, is there anything we can learn from what he did then that might inform even our approach to how we move towards the reforms you're thinking about today? Because he was starting from, the bedrock. How do you begin to define this? Who do you talk to? Where do you go? How do you get it through? And you're raising similar questions now as to how we move it forward to the next level. Can we still learn from the giants of the past?
I mean, I would love to be able to learn more. Maybe I can get access to those papers or something like that. But in terms of, how it got into the actual legislation, it really does seem like an access story and a behind the scenes story, because it was not in any of the drafts until the committee stage in Congress, when it got kind of slipped into the bill during the committee conference, the conference committee, not the committees in either house. And so it really does seem like, this was going on. It seemed like it was, both at Taconic, but also at a couple of other foundations in the area. It seemed like it was promising and not something that should be, cut off by mistake by the way the law was being drafted. And so because, folks at those foundations did have access to some of the real key decision makers, they were able to get this kind of special exception that birthed this whole concept, right? So I do definitely take it as a story of what is possible. Although it also is, a little bit of a, I have a little bit of pause about it, because it really does not seem like it happened with a lot of kind of care in terms of the regulation adoption by the legislators. I think there was a lot of care in drafting and what gets put in forward, but in terms of how it actually gets into the law and how the sausages are made, I think you could kind of tell a different type of story. So obviously, folks in the sector need to get behind this, and I think some of the folks I'm working on this project with really are interested in doing that work, developing something that's really workable and that is very carefully drafted in a way to mesh with the existing regulatory architecture. But then in terms of getting it in front of the right people who have the power in the right places to get it into the law, I'm feeling a little better about that than I was last week, but we'll have to wait and see.
I think the Rockefeller Archives may be a useful source for some of that backstory around how it came about. So it might be somewhere to look.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much, particularly the audience, and particularly Lloyd, Dana, and Norm for their terrific presentations. And thank you all.